I was sitting in my son's living room when I saw my daughter-in-law's Facebook post, finally putting Mom in a nursing home. She's become a burden. I smiled, grabbed my phone, and made one call that changed everything. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Let me tell you about Margaret Peterson. At 68 years old, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd weathered every storm life threw at her and came out standing. Her silver hair, always neatly pinned back, framed a face etched with smile lines earned from decades of genuine kindness. Her hands, though aged and marked with veins, were strong. The hands of a woman who'd worked every day of her life and never complained about it. Margaret wasn't born into privilege. She grew up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress. She learned early that nothing in life was free and everything worth having required sacrifice. When she met Robert Peterson at 19, she thought she'd found her forever. They married young, built a modest life, and when David was born, Margaret believed her world was complete. Then Robert died. A heart attack at 35, leaving Margaret a widow with a 7-year-old son and a mountain of medical debt. Most people would have crumbled. Margaret enrolled in nursing school instead. For the next 4 years, she worked nights at a diner, studied during David's school hours, and somehow managed to be at every parent-teacher conference, every baseball game, every moment that mattered. She graduated top of her class and spent the next 40 years as a registered nurse, healing others while quietly breaking herself. Every dollar she earned went to David. She paid for his college tuition in full, no student loans for her boy. She helped with his wedding, contributed to the down payment on his first home, and never once asked for anything in return. When David called 3 years ago, panicked about foreclosure, Margaret didn't hesitate. She sold the home she'd worked 30 years to pay off and gave him $180,000 to save his family. That's who Margaret was. A woman who believed family meant everything. A woman who gave until there was nothing left to give. A woman whose only mistake was trusting that love would be enough. She was about to learn a devastating truth. For some people, love has a price tag, and once you stop being useful, you become disposable. Margaret's life had fallen into a rhythm she found comforting. Every morning at 6 o'clock, her eyes would open before the alarm, a habit from 40 years of nursing shifts that her body refused to break. She'd slip out of the small guest bedroom quietly, careful not to wake anyone, and pad downstairs in her worn slippers to start the coffee maker. The kitchen was her domain in these early hours, a peaceful sanctuary where she could think and breathe before the chaos of family life began. By 6:30, the smell of fresh coffee and pancakes would fill the house. Margaret took pride in her cooking, especially breakfast. She'd make Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes for 8-year-old Lucas, who still believed in magic, and cinnamon French toast for 10-year-old Emma, who was becoming too grown up too fast. She'd have everything plated and ready by 7:15, right when she'd hear the thunder of small feet racing down the stairs. "Grandma, you made my favorite," Lucas would squeal, wrapping his skinny arms around her waist. Emma, more reserved but equally loving, would kiss Margaret's cheek and whisper, "You're the best, Grandma." These moments made everything worth it. Every sacrifice, every struggle, every lonely night. It all made sense when she saw their faces light up. David would come down next, usually buried in his phone, checking work emails before his commute. He'd grab coffee, ruffle his kid's hair, and offer Margaret a distracted smile. "Thanks, Mom. You didn't have to do all this." But she wanted to. She needed to feel useful, needed to contribute something to make up for taking up space in their home. Jessica typically rushed through, always running late, grabbing a protein bar instead of sitting down. "Morning, Margaret," she'd say breezily, her eyes never quite meeting the older woman's. Margaret told herself it was just stress. Everyone was so busy these days. After breakfast, Margaret would walk the family's golden retriever, Bailey, through the tree-lined suburban streets. She loved these morning walks, waving to neighbors, stopping to chat with Mrs. Henderson about her roses, watching the world wake up. She'd return by 9, start a load of laundry, tidy the already clean kitchen, and plan dinner, grocery shopping on Tuesdays, volunteering at the church food bank on Wednesdays, her book club on Thursday afternoons. The house showed Margaret's touch everywhere. The garden she'd planted bursting with tomatoes, herbs, and sunflowers, the perfectly organized linen closet, the kids' school projects displayed on the refrigerator, the family photo wall she'd created, chronicling every birthday, holiday, and milestone. She'd made this house a home, not just for David and Jessica, but for herself. This was supposed to be her forever place, surrounded by the family she'd given everything to build. In the afternoons, she'd pick up Emma and Lucas from school, listening to their stories about teachers and friends and playground drama. They'd have snacks at the kitchen table, homemade cookies and milk, and she'd help with homework before their parents got home. Evenings meant family dinners that Margaret prepared, followed by dishes she'd wash while everyone scattered to their own activities. At night, before bed, Margaret would read to Lucas from his favorite adventure books and talk with Emma about school dramas and growing up worries. She'd kiss them goodnight, retreat to her small room, and fall asleep feeling purposeful, feeling needed, feeling like she belonged. She had no idea her perfect routine was built on a foundation that was already crumbling beneath her feet. It started on a Tuesday evening in late September. Margaret had taken Bailey for their usual afternoon walk, but dark clouds rolled in faster than expected. The first drops of rain sent her hurrying back, cutting the walk short by 15 minutes. She came through the back door, shaking off her umbrella, expecting the house to be empty. David wouldn't be home for another hour, and Jessica had mentioned a late meeting. But voices drifted from the kitchen, sharp voices, tense voices. "I can't do this anymore, David. I just can't." Jessica's tone carried a frustration Margaret had never heard before, raw and unfiltered. "She's always here, always watching, always in the way. I can't even relax in my own home." Margaret froze in the mudroom, one hand still on the doorknob. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew she should announce herself, should make noise, should do something. But her feet wouldn't move. David's response was quieter, harder to hear. "Jess, keep your voice down. She could come back any minute." "I don't care." Jessica's voice cracked with emotion. "We need to do something. This was supposed to be temporary, remember? Temporary. It's been 3 years, David. 3 years of tiptoeing around, of never having privacy, of her hovering over the kids like she's their mother." The floorboard creaked under Margaret's foot. The conversation stopped like someone had cut a wire. Sudden, complete silence. Margaret's mind raced. Should she go back outside and come in again, louder this time? Should she pretend she hadn't heard anything? Her pulse thundered in her ears. Jessica appeared in the doorway, her face composed, but her eyes were hard and bright. "Oh, Margaret, didn't hear you come in." The smile she painted on looked painful. "How was your walk?" Margaret forced her own smile, tried to make her voice sound normal. "It started raining, dear. Just came back to grab an umbrella for Bailey. The poor thing doesn't like getting wet." The lie felt thick on her tongue. Bailey was already inside, shaking himself dry in the mudroom. "Oh, of course." Jessica's fingers drummed against the doorframe. "Well, I was just heading upstairs to change. Long day." She disappeared before Margaret could respond. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, the rain now drumming steadily against the windows. She looked around at the space she'd cleaned that morning, at the dinner ingredients she'd already laid out on the counter, at the children's artwork she'd hung on the refrigerator. She's always here, always watching, always in the way. The words echoed in her head, each repetition feeling like a small cut. Margaret pressed her palm against her chest, trying to steady her breathing. No, she must have misunderstood. Jessica was stressed. Work was demanding. Marriage was hard. People said things they didn't mean when they were overwhelmed. That night, Margaret lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The house settled and creaked around her. Down the hall, she could hear the muffled sounds of David and Jessica talking, their voices too low to make out words, but the tone unmistakable, serious, prolonged. About her? She rolled onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow, Jessica would smile her real smile, and everything would go back to normal. Margaret just needed to try harder, be more helpful, take up less space. She could do that. She'd spent her whole life making herself smaller for the people she loved, always in the way. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Margaret woke the next morning with a plan. She would prove them wrong. Whatever Jessica had meant by those words, Margaret would show her that she wasn't a burden. She was helpful. She was needed. She was family. She started earlier than usual, creeping downstairs at 5:30 instead of 6. By the time anyone woke, the kitchen sparkled, breakfast was ready, lunches were packed with extra care, and Margaret had already walked Bailey and folded 2 loads of laundry. When Jessica came down at 7, Margaret greeted her with a warm smile and fresh coffee. "Good morning, dear. I hope you slept well. I made your favorite. Egg white omelet with spinach and feta." Jessica blinked, startled. "Oh, thanks, Margaret." She took the plate but didn't sit down, eating standing up while scrolling through her phone. The conversation from yesterday hung between them like invisible smoke, but neither acknowledged it. Over the following days, Margaret watched. She studied every interaction, analyzed every word, searched for signs that things were falling apart. David seemed distracted, but he was always distracted. Work stress, right? Jessica's responses were clipped, but she'd been that way before too, hadn't she? Margaret replayed memories, trying to convince herself this was normal, this was fine, this was just a rough patch. Maybe she's going through something personal, Margaret told herself while scrubbing the bathroom tiles. Women's issues, hormones, I should be more understanding. She noticed Jessica's phone calls, though, quick, hushed conversations that ended when Margaret entered the room. One afternoon, while Margaret was dusting the living room, Jessica stepped onto the back porch and closed the door. Through the window, Margaret could see her pacing, gesturing with one hand. "Yes, we're looking into options," Jessica said, her voice just barely audible. "It's getting too much. We need to make a decision soon." Margaret's stomach twisted. When Jessica came back inside, Margaret asked casually, "Everything okay, dear? You look stressed." "Just work stuff," Jessica said quickly. Too quickly. "And we're looking at daycares for Lucas, trying to find something closer." Margaret's brow furrowed. "But Lucas is in kindergarten now. He doesn't need daycare." Jessica's eyes flashed with something, irritation, panic, before she caught herself. "I meant after-school programs. You know what I mean." She brushed past Margaret and headed upstairs. That didn't make sense. Lucas already had after-school activities that Margaret picked him up from. But Margaret pushed the doubt down, locked it away in the growing box of worries she refused to open. She tried harder. She woke earlier, worked longer, made herself scarce when David and Jessica were home. She'd finish dinner and retreat to her room, giving them privacy. She stopped offering unsolicited help with the children. She stopped sharing stories at dinner. She made herself as small and invisible as possible, hoping that would fix whatever was broken. At night, she'd lie awake and bargain with herself. "You're being paranoid. They love you. David is your son. You raised him. He would never hurt you. Jessica is just stressed. This is a phase. Families go through phases. Everything will be fine if you just try harder." But trying harder felt like drowning slowly. Each day, Margaret felt herself disappearing a little more, erasing pieces of herself to make room for their comfort. And still, the tension in the house grew thicker, heavier, like a storm building on the horizon. She told herself she was imagining it. She had to be imagining it. Because if she wasn't, if those whispers and glances and closed-door conversations meant what she feared they meant, then everything she'd believed about family, about love, about the life she'd sacrificed everything to build. All of it was a lie, and Margaret couldn't bear that truth. Not yet. The truth arrived on a Thursday afternoon disguised as an accident. Margaret was in her room folding laundry. David's shirts, Jessica's blouses, the children's school uniforms. She'd developed a system. Sort by person, fold by type, stack by drawer. Simple, orderly, controllable. The mundane task kept her hands busy and her mind quiet, away from the gnawing anxiety that had taken up residence in her chest. That's when she noticed it, a manila folder lying half-hidden under a sweater on her dresser. It must have fallen from David's briefcase that morning when he'd rushed in to grab his forgotten laptop charger. She'd heard him cursing under his breath, the sound of zippers and shuffling papers, then his hurried footsteps down the stairs. Margaret picked up the folder, intending to set it aside for him. The label caught her eye. Shady Pines Senior Living, information packet. Her breath stopped. Maybe it was for a client. David worked in real estate. He dealt with properties all the time. That had to be it. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder, telling herself she'd just peek to make sure, to put her mind at ease. Inside were glossy brochures showing smiling elderly people in pale blue cardigans, playing cards in sterile activity rooms. Where family comes. First, proclaimed the tagline beneath a photo of a gray-haired woman being visited by people who were clearly actors. Margaret had worked in healthcare long enough to know the reality behind these staged photographs, but it was the paperwork underneath that made her knees buckle. An application form, half completed, in David's precise handwriting. Resident name, Margaret Ann Peterson. Date of birth, March 15, 1957. Medical history, hypertension controlled, arthritis mild, no cognitive impairment, emergency contact, David Mitchell, son relationship to applicant, son financial responsibility, Medicaid application pending. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard, forcing herself to focus on the words. At the bottom of the page, in Jessica's looping script, were handwritten notes in the margins. Memory care wing? Too expensive. Standard room sufficient. Check Medicaid eligibility. She has no assets left. No assets left, because she'd given it all to them. Margaret's legs gave out. She sank onto the edge of her bed, the folder slipping from her fingers and scattering papers across the floor. Pricing sheets fluttered down like dying leaves. $4,500 per month for a standard room, $1,800 for memory care, payment plans, Medicaid applications, visiting hour policies, 2 hours per week recommended to help with adjustment. This wasn't a someday plan. This wasn't a let's research options just in case situation. This was real. This was active. This was happening. Margaret stared at the brochures scattered around her feet. She'd visited facilities like Shady Pines during her nursing career. She knew what they smelled like, disinfectant and boiled vegetables and quiet desperation. She knew what the rooms really looked like. 10 by 12 feet, a single bed, a small TV mounted to the wall, a bathroom you shared with a stranger. She knew about the loneliness, the way families visited less and less until they stopped coming altogether. She knew about patients who sat by windows, waiting for children who never showed up. And they were planning to put her there, without asking her, without even telling her. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, swallowing the sob that threatened to tear out of her throat. The walls of her small bedroom seemed to close in. This room, this house, was supposed to be her home. She'd paid for it. She'd bled for it. And now they wanted to erase her from it completely. She gathered the papers with shaking hands, carefully placing them back in the folder exactly as she'd found them. They couldn't know she'd seen this. Not yet. She needed time to think, to understand, to figure out what this meant. But deep down, Margaret already knew exactly what it meant. She was expendable. Margaret didn't confront them. She couldn't. Not yet. Every instinct screamed at her to march downstairs and demand answers, to wave the folder in their faces and ask how they could do this to her. But 40 years as a nurse had taught her patience, had taught her to assess the situation fully before acting, had taught her that knowledge was power, and she didn't have the full picture yet. For 3 days, she moved through the house like a ghost. She watched, she listened, she hurt. She saw the way David avoided her eyes at breakfast, the way Jessica's jaw tightened when Margaret offered to help with anything, the way they'd go silent when she entered a room, then resume talking in forced, cheerful tones about meaningless things, weather, traffic, grocery lists, never anything real, never anything true. Margaret felt like she was standing outside her own life, watching it through glass. Everything looked the same but felt completely different. The kitchen where she made breakfast every morning now felt like enemy territory. The living room where she'd read to her grandchildren now felt like a place she was trespassing. Even her own bedroom felt temporary, borrowed, like a hotel room she'd be asked to vacate at any moment. Then came Sunday afternoon. David and Jessica had taken the kids to Jessica's parents' house for lunch. Margaret stayed home, claiming a headache. In truth, she couldn't bear another few hours of pretending everything was normal, pretending she didn't know, pretending her heart wasn't breaking. She sat in the living room, their living room, surrounded by the life she'd helped build. The television played some forgettable program in the background. She wasn't watching. She picked up her phone, mindlessly scrolling through Facebook, desperate for any distraction from the thoughts eating her alive. That's when she saw it. A new post from Jessica Mitchell, posted 47 minutes ago, public. All 847 friends could see it. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Finally putting Mom in a nursing home. She's become a burden we can't carry anymore. Sometimes you have to choose your own family's peace over guilt. It's time. Tough choices. Moving forward. Self-care. Margaret's hand started shaking so violently she nearly dropped the phone. She read it again and again. Her eyes caught on that one word, the word that made bile rise in her throat. Burden. 40 years of sacrifice. 40 years of putting David first, selling her home, to save theirs. And she was a burden. The comments were already rolling in. You're so brave for sharing this. You're doing the right thing. It's so hard but necessary. Take care of yourself, girl. Proud of you for prioritizing your family's needs, sending strength. 847 people. Jessica had told 847 people that Margaret was a burden before telling Margaret herself that she was being sent away. Margaret scrolled down. More comments. More strangers validating her erasure. More people celebrating her removal from the family she'd built with her own blood, sweat, and tears. Her vision blurred. The phone screen became a watercolor of words and emojis and profile pictures. She looked up, blinking hard, trying to hold herself together. Through the window, she could see the garden she'd planted, tomatoes she'd never harvest, sunflowers she'd never see bloom, the swing set she'd helped David build for Emma and Lucas, pushing them for hours until her arms ached. This was her home. She'd paid for it. She'd earned it. She'd loved these people with everything she had. And this was how they repaid her, not with a conversation, not with honesty, but with a public announcement of her disposal, shared with the world like it was something to be proud of. Margaret set the phone down carefully on the coffee table. Her hands were still shaking, but something else was building inside her now. Something cold and sharp and focused. She wasn't just hurt anymore, she was awake. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. The house was quiet, everyone in bed, but her mind raced like an engine that wouldn't shut off. She lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction from the past 3 years, every smile that didn't reach their eyes, every promise that was never kept, every time David said, "We'll take care of it later," when she asked about making their arrangement official. At 2 a.m, she gave up on sleep. She slid out of bed and pulled a cardboard box from under it. The box she'd packed 3 years ago when she sold her house. The The box she hadn't opened since moving in because it hurt too much to look at her old life, her independence, everything she'd given up. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid. Inside were files, documents, memories, her marriage certificate, Robert's death certificate, old tax returns, and there, buried beneath layers of her past, the paperwork from the house sale. Margaret spread the documents across her bed in the dim light of her reading lamp. Bank statements showing the wire transfer, $180,000 from Margaret A. Peterson to David R. Mitchell, dated October 15, 2022, the deposit that saved them from foreclosure. And there was the agreement, handwritten on legal pad paper, signed by all three of them at the kitchen table that desperate afternoon when David had broken down crying, when Jessica had held Margaret's hands and promised, "We're family forever." In exchange for financial contribution of $180,000 to save family home from foreclosure, Margaret Peterson will retain 40% ownership of property located at 847 Maple Drive. Official legal documentation to follow. David's signature, Jessica's signature, Margaret's signature, dated and witnessed. But there was no official legal documentation, no deed with her name on it, no formal agreement filed with the county. Just this piece of paper and a promise. Margaret's pulse quickened. She dug deeper into the box, finding more files. Then she saw it. A letter she'd never noticed before, dated 6 months ago. It had been mixed in with old mail, something David must have left in the box accidentally. It was a mortgage refinancing statement from First National Bank. David and Jessica had refinanced the house in March. The new mortgage, $425,000. Borrowers, David R. Mitchell and Jessica L. Mitchell. No mention of Margaret anywhere. Margaret's breath caught in her chest. They'd refinanced. They'd taken out a larger loan, probably at a better rate, and they'd done it without telling her, without disclosing her $180,000 investment, without listing her as a partial owner. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about getting rid of an inconvenient old woman. This wasn't just about wanting privacy or space or peace. This was about money. This was about erasing her from the property completely so they could have full control, so they could refinance, sell, or do whatever they wanted without her claim hanging over their heads. The nursing home wasn't about her care or her needs. It was about removing the evidence, removing the witness, removing the person who could prove she'd paid for nearly half this house. Without her here, without any legal documentation, she'd have no claim. She'd be just another forgotten old woman in a facility somewhere with no leverage, no home, no proof. And David and Jessica would have a $425,000 mortgage on a house that Margaret had saved, with her $180,000 effectively erased from history. Margaret looked around her tiny room, at the single window that faced the neighbor's fence, at the closet barely big enough for her clothes, at the life she'd squeezed into the smallest possible space to accommodate their comfort. She'd given them everything, and they wanted to erase her like she'd never existed. But Margaret had the documents, she had the proof, she had the signatures, and she was beginning to have a plan. Margaret sat on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by documents and photographs that chronicled a life of sacrifice. The papers blurred through her tears. Her chest felt like it was caving in, each breath a struggle against the weight of betrayal pressing down on her. She picked up a photo, David at 6 months old, chubby and smiling, gripping her finger with his tiny hand. She remembered that day, remembered the overwhelming love that had flooded through her when she first held him. The promise she'd made, "I will give you everything. I will make sure you have a better life than I did." Another photo. David at 7, clutching her hand at Robert's funeral, his face pale and confused. She'd held him that night while he cried himself to sleep, promising him, "We'll be okay. Mommy's here. I'll always be here." She'd kept that promise. God, how she'd kept it. Margaret sobbed, deep, wrenching cries that came from somewhere primal. She pressed the photo to her chest and rocked back and forth, remembering. The nights she'd work double shifts at the hospital, coming home at dawn to wake David for school. The birthday she'd spent in the ER instead of at his party because they needed the overtime pay. The college acceptance letter from his first choice. Expensive, so expensive, and her decision to take out loans she'd only just finished paying off last year. "I gave you everything," she whispered to the boy in the photograph. "Everything I had, everything I was." More photos scattered across the floor, David's high school graduation, his face beaming with pride as he gave his valedictorian speech, thanking "my incredible mother who sacrificed everything so I could be here today." She'd cried then, too. Tears of joy, of pride, of feeling like every sacrifice had been worth it. David's wedding day. She'd paid for half of it, $15,000 she couldn't really afford, but gave anyway because that's what mothers do. In the photo, David had his arm around her, kissing her cheek. The caption Jessica had posted on social media that day, "Blessed to marry into such a loving family." Loving family. The words tasted like ash now. Margaret pulled out her wedding photo, young Margaret and Robert, 20 years old and stupidly in love. "I failed," she whispered to Robert's frozen smile. "I raised a man who could throw his mother away like garbage. Where did I go wrong? What did I do?" The grief wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about what the betrayal meant. That love wasn't enough. That sacrifice wasn't enough. That being a good mother, a devoted mother, a mother who gave until she had nothing left, it wasn't enough to earn basic human decency from her own child. Margaret remembered her own mother. She died in a nursing home, alone and forgotten, her mind stolen by dementia. Margaret had been working, always working, and hadn't made it in time to say goodbye. She'd knelt by her mother's empty bed and sworn an oath. "I will never let this happen to anyone I love. I will never abandon family." Now it was happening to her, by her own son, the boy she'd raised to be better, to be kind, to value family above everything. Margaret curled into herself on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. Photos and documents surrounded her like debris from a shipwreck. She felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except pain. The weight of it was crushing, suffocating. For hours she stayed there in the darkness, broken. Dawn crept through Margaret's window, pale and cold. She'd been on the floor all night, her body stiff, her eyes swollen and raw from crying. The photographs lay scattered around her like fallen leaves, a life in pictures, a testament to love that hadn't been enough. But something had shifted in those dark hours between midnight and morning. Margaret pushed herself up slowly, her joints protesting. She caught her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser and barely recognized herself. Red-rimmed eyes, gray hair disheveled, face drawn with exhaustion and grief. She looked like a victim. She looked defeated. She looked exactly like what they wanted her to be. Margaret stepped closer to the mirror, studying the woman staring back at her. Yes, she was 68. Yes, her face showed every year of struggle and sacrifice. But behind the exhaustion, behind the pain, she saw something else. Something she'd forgotten was there. Steel. The same steel that had gotten her through Robert's death when everyone said she should sell the house and move back with her parents. The same strength that had pushed her through nursing school while working full-time and raising a child alone. The same determination that had pulled double shifts for 40 years without complaint. Margaret straightened her shoulders. She was Margaret Ann Peterson, RN. She'd spent 4 decades in emergency rooms, making life-or-death decisions under pressure. She'd held crying mothers, told families their loved ones were gone, performed CPR until her arms gave out. She'd managed hospital politics, documented everything, outmaneuvered doctors who thought nurses were beneath them. She wasn't some helpless old woman. She was a survivor, a fighter, and she'd forgotten that somewhere along the way, lost it in her desperation to be loved, to be wanted, to belong. "Never again," she whispered to her reflection. Margaret turned away from the mirror and looked at the documents spread across her floor. The evidence, the proof, the ammunition. A nurse knew the value of documentation. A nurse knew that everything had to be recorded, verified, backed up with evidence. And Margaret had evidence. The fog of grief that had suffocated her all night began to lift, replaced by something cold and clear and focused. She wasn't going to cry anymore. She wasn't going to beg or plead or make herself smaller. She'd spent 3 years, trying to earn a place in a home she'd paid for. 3 years apologizing for existing. 3 years being grateful for scraps of affection from people who saw her as nothing but a burden to dispose of. That ended today. Margaret knelt and began gathering the documents, organizing them with practiced efficiency. Bank statements in one pile, the handwritten agreement in another, the refinancing letter that proved fraud. Each paper was a weapon, and she was building an arsenal. She pulled out her phone and opened her contacts. Robert Chen, her late husband's attorney friend. Sarah Miller, the elder law specialist she'd read about in the newspaper. Linda, from work, who'd moved into elder advocacy. Margaret had resources. She had allies. She had rights. Most importantly, she had nothing left to lose. They'd made a critical mistake. They'd underestimated her. They'd mistaken her kindness for weakness, her love for stupidity, her silence for acceptance. They'd forgotten that the woman they were trying to erase had spent 40 years fighting for everyone but herself. Now she was going to fight for herself. And when Margaret Peterson fought, she fought to win. She looked at the photograph of David as a baby one last time, then carefully placed it back in the box. That boy was gone. The man who'd replaced him had made his choice. Now Margaret was making hers. She picked up her phone and began making calls, not to beg, not to cry, but to build her counterattack. It was time to remind her son exactly who his mother was. Margaret's first call was to Robert Chen at 7:30 Monday morning. Robert had been her late husband's college roommate and best man at their wedding. He'd helped her with Robert's estate after he died and had handled the paperwork when she sold her house 3 years ago. He was semi-retired now, but Margaret knew he'd take her call. "Margaret, is everything all right?" His voice carried immediate concern. "Robert, I need your legal expertise. I have documentation of a $180,000 investment in property, a signed agreement for partial ownership that was never formalized, and I need to know my rights." There was a pause. "Tell me everything." For 20 minutes, Margaret laid out the facts with clinical precision. The foreclosure rescue, the handwritten agreement, the 3 years of promises, the nursing home plans, the Facebook post, the refinancing she'd discovered. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She presented the case like the professional she was. Robert's voice turned sharp. "Margaret, do you still have the original agreement, the bank statements? Every single document. Don't let those out of your sight. I need to see them today. If what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't just a family dispute. This is fraud." They met at a coffee shop 2 hours later. Robert spread the documents across the table, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he looked up. "Margaret, they refinanced without disclosing your investment. That's mortgage fraud. You have a signed agreement, even handwritten. It's legally binding when combined with the bank records proving your contribution. You don't just have a claim to partial ownership. You could force a sale of the entire property or demand full repayment with interest." Margaret's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "What are my options?" "Aggressive ones." Robert pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Sarah Miller. She specializes in elder financial abuse. This is her battlefield." By that afternoon, Margaret sat in Sarah Miller's downtown office. Sarah was 45, sharp-eyed, and had a reputation for demolishing families who exploited elderly relatives. Her walls were covered with commendations and news clippings. Attorney recovers $2.3 million for defrauded senior. Elder abuse specialist wins record settlement. Sarah listened to Margaret's story, her jaw tightening. When Margaret showed her the Facebook post on her phone, Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "They posted this publicly? Before even talking to you?" Sarah leaned forward. "Margaret, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. What they've done is textbook elder financial abuse, fraud, exploitation, and we're going to bury them." Over the next week, Margaret operated in complete secrecy. While David and Jessica went about their lives, planning her removal, Margaret was building her case. She contacted Linda, her former nursing supervisor who now worked with an elder advocacy organization. Linda was furious. "Screenshot everything, Margaret. That Facebook post, that's evidence of elder abuse. Save every comment, every text message, every conversation." Margaret bought a small digital recorder and began documenting. She recorded dinner conversations where Jessica complained about the inconvenience of having her there. She saved text messages between David and Jessica that she found on the family iPad they'd carelessly left unlocked. "How much longer do we have to deal with this?" "Shady Pines has an opening next month." She photographed every document. She made copies and stored them in a safety deposit box at a different bank. She compiled 3 years of financial records showing her contributions to the household, groceries, utilities, repairs, all paid from her modest retirement savings. Sarah Miller filed a legal claim for Margaret's $180,000 investment plus 3 years of interest at the statutory rate, $247,000. But more importantly, Sarah filed for a lien against the property itself. "This is the nuclear option," Sarah explained. "A lien means they can't sell, refinance, or do anything with that property until they pay you back. And if they can't pay within 30 days, we force a sale and you get your money first." Margaret signed the papers without hesitation. "When do we tell them?" Margaret asked. Sarah smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "We don't tell them. The bank does." The lien was filed on a Wednesday. Margaret knew it would take approximately 5 business days for the bank to process and notify David and Jessica. 5 days where she had to pretend everything was normal. 5 days of living in a house that felt like a ticking time bomb. 5 days of watching them plan her removal while she planned their reckoning. Margaret had never been a good actress, but 40 years of nursing had taught her to maintain composure under pressure. She moved through those days like a woman walking a tightrope, every smile carefully measured, every word precisely chosen. She made breakfast, she folded laundry, she picked up the grandchildren from school, and she waited. On Saturday morning, David announced they were having family over for lunch tomorrow. His voice was too casual, his eyes avoiding hers. "Jessica's parents are driving in from Ohio, just a casual get-together." Margaret's stomach tightened, but she kept her face neutral. "That sounds lovely. Should I make my pot roast?" No, we've got it covered," Jessica said quickly, her fingers drumming nervously against the kitchen counter. "You just relax, Margaret. Enjoy your day." They were planning the intervention. Margaret knew it with absolute certainty. Jessica's parents as witnesses, as reinforcements, as validation. The whole family gathered to tell her she was being sent away, probably expecting her to cry and accept it gracefully, to go quietly. That night, Margaret barely slept. She lay in bed, running through scenarios in her mind. She'd watched enough courtroom dramas, sat through enough hospital ethics meetings to know how these confrontations worked. They'd painted as concern, as love, as what's best for everyone. They'd have their talking points rehearsed, their reasons lined up like soldiers. But so did she. Sunday morning arrived with cruel sunshine. Margaret dressed carefully, a navy blue blouse, gray slacks, her small pearl earrings that Robert had given her on their 20th anniversary. She wanted to look dignified, respectable, like someone who couldn't be dismissed or erased. At 11 o'clock, Jessica's parents arrived, Tom and Barbara Henderson, pleasant, conventional people who'd always been kind to Margaret at family events. Barbara hugged her warmly. "Margaret, so good to see you. You look wonderful." "Thank you, Barbara. It's lovely to have you here." Margaret helped set out lunch, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She watched Jessica and her mother exchange meaningful glances, watched David checking his phone obsessively, his leg bouncing under the table with nervous energy, watched Emma and Lucas picking at their food, sensing the tension even if they didn't understand it. After lunch, David cleared his throat. "Actually, we wanted to talk about something important. Why don't we all go to the living room?" Here it was. They arranged themselves like actors taking their places. David and Jessica on the love seat, positioned together as a united front. Barbara and Tom on the couch, looking uncomfortable but supportive. Emma and Lucas were sent upstairs to play despite Emma's protests. And Margaret sat alone in the armchair by the window, the afternoon light streaming behind her. Her purse sat on the floor beside her chair. Inside it was a folder. Inside the folder was everything she needed. David began, his voice taking on that rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this speech. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation. We love you so much, but we think it's time to discuss some changes that would be better for everyone." Jessica leaned forward, her hands clasped together in a gesture of false compassion. "We've been doing research, Margaret. There are wonderful senior communities where you'd have so much more support, activities, people your own age." "Shady Pines," Margaret said quietly. "You mean Shady Pines?" Jessica blinked, momentarily thrown. "Well, yes, it's a lovely facility. We've already done the preliminary paperwork. They have an opening next month in a beautiful room." "You filled out an application in my name without my knowledge or consent," Margaret said, her voice still calm. She could feel her heart pounding, but her hands were steady. Nurse steady. David jumped in. "Mom, we were going to talk to you about it. We just wanted to have all the information first, before posting it on Facebook for 847 people to see." The room went silent. Jessica's face drained of color. Barbara looked confused, glancing between her daughter and Margaret. David tried to recover. "Mom, you're misunderstanding." "Am I?" Margaret reached down and picked up her purse. "Because I think it's time we talked about understanding, about honesty, about what's really happening here." She placed the folder on her lap, her fingers resting on its edge. Every eye in the room was on her now. Jessica's voice rose, defensive and sharp. "Margaret, we love you, but this has become too much. You're here all the time, always underfoot, always watching. We need our space. We need our lives back. Can't you understand that?" "A burden," Margaret said softly. "That's the word you used. A burden you can't carry anymore." Jessica's mother gasped. "Jessica, you didn't—" "This is exactly what we're talking about." Jessica stood up, her composure cracking. "You're always there, always judging, always making us feel guilty. We have kids to raise, careers to manage. We can't spend our lives taking care of you." The words hung in the air like smoke. David looked at the floor, his face flushed with shame but saying nothing. Not defending his mother, not correcting his wife, just sitting there, letting it happen. This was the moment Margaret had been waiting for, the moment when all their careful pretense shattered and the truth came spilling out ugly and raw. She opened the folder. "Actually," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgical blade, "we need to talk about fraud, elder abuse, and theft." The room froze. Tom Henderson sat up straighter. Barbara's hand went to her mouth. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with confusion and dawning fear. Jessica remained standing, but her defiant posture wavered. Margaret kept her voice steady, clinical, the way she'd delivered difficult news to families for 40 years. "Let me show you something." She pulled the first document from her folder and placed it on the coffee table. A bank statement. October 15th, 2022. A wire transfer of $180,000 from my account to David and Jessica Mitchell. Does anyone remember why I made this transfer? David's face went pale. "Mom, we can explain. This house was in foreclosure," Margaret continued, ignoring him. "David called me crying. Jessica was pregnant with Lucas. They were going to lose everything. So I sold my house, the house I'd worked 30 years to pay off, and I gave them this money. Not loaned, gave, because that's what mothers do for their children. She placed another document down, the handwritten agreement. In exchange, we made an agreement, signed by all three of us, that I would retain 40% ownership of this property. David promised we'd make it official with a lawyer. Later, he said. We'll handle it later. Barbara leaned forward, reading the signatures. Her face hardened as she recognized her daughter's handwriting. We never made it official, Margaret said. I trusted my son. I trusted my family. I moved into that tiny guest room and I waited. 3 years I waited. Jessica found her voice, shrill and defensive. We were going to pay you back. We just needed time. Time? Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. She pulled out the refinancing statement. Is that why you refinanced the mortgage 6 months ago without telling me? Without disclosing my investment? You took out a $425,000 loan on a house I saved from foreclosure, and you didn't include me in any of it. Tom Henderson took the paper from the table, his expression darkening as he read. Jessica, is this true? You refinanced without telling her? That's mortgage fraud, Margaret said flatly. Failing to disclose a known financial interest in the property during refinancing is fraud. David stood up, his hands raised in a placating gesture that made Margaret's blood boil. Mom, we didn't think. You said it was a gift. You said you wanted to help. I have our agreement in writing, Margaret cut him off. Signed by you, by her, by me. A gift doesn't come with an ownership agreement, David. She pulled out her phone, her hands perfectly steady now. But let's talk about gifts. Let's talk about burdens. Because I found something interesting last Sunday. Margaret opened Facebook and turned the phone so everyone could see Jessica's post. Then she read it aloud, her voice clear and unwavering. Finally putting Mom in a nursing home, she's become a burden we can't carry anymore. Sometimes you have to choose your own family's peace over guilt. It's time. Hashtag tough choices. Hashtag moving forward. Hashtag self-care. Barbara gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Jessica Marie Henderson, tell me you did not post that. 847 people saw this, Margaret continued. 847 people were told I was a burden before I was told I was being sent away. I found out I was being disposed of by reading it on Facebook while sitting in this very room. Jessica's composure shattered. Tears sprang to her eyes. I was frustrated. I was venting. You don't understand what it's like having someone here all the time. Someone who paid for half your house? Margaret's voice turned to ice. Someone who cooks your meals, cleans your home, raises your children while you work? That's someone? Tom stood up, his face red with anger. Jessica, we raised you better than this. This woman gave you nearly $200,000. It gets better, Margaret said. She pulled out the Shady Pines application. They filled out a nursing home application in my name, without my knowledge, without my consent. Listed me as having no assets. She looked directly at David. No assets, because you took them all. David sank back onto the love seat, his head in his hands. Jessica stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, but Margaret felt no pity. None. This is elder financial abuse, Margaret said. This is fraud. This is exploitation. And I documented all of it. She pulled out printed screenshots of text messages, recordings, timestamps, grocery receipts showing 3 years of her paying for household expenses while they planned to throw her away. You wanted me gone so you could erase me, Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly before she steeled herself again. So you could have full control of a house I saved. So you could pretend I never contributed anything. So you could avoid paying me back what I'm owed. We'll pay you back. David's voice was desperate now. Mom, please, we'll figure it out. You can't, Margaret said. She pulled out the final document, the one she'd been saving. Because 5 days ago, my attorney filed a legal claim against this property, a lien for $247,000, my original investment plus interest. The color drained from Jessica's face. What? As of Wednesday, you owe me $247,000, secured by a lien against this house. You have 30 days to pay it. Margaret's voice was perfectly calm now, delivering the death blow with surgical precision. If you can't pay, the house goes into forced sale, and I get my money first before you see a penny. David shot to his feet, panic flooding his features. You can't do this. We have kids. We have nowhere to go. You should have thought about that before you committed fraud, Margaret said. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. You should have thought about it before you called me a burden, before you erased me, before you forgot that I'm the reason you have anything at all. Barbara was crying now, staring at her daughter with horror and disappointment. Tom had his arms crossed, his jaw clenched tight. The truth was laid bare in documents and screenshots, and undeniable evidence spread across the coffee table like an autopsy. Jessica collapsed back onto the love seat, sobbing. This will ruin us. We can't pay that. We'll lose everything. Margaret stood up, gathering her folder. Her legs felt weak, but she wouldn't let them see it. You already lost everything. You just didn't know it yet. She looked at the faces around her. Shock, shame, fear, disgust. The intervention had become an execution. The victims had become the exposed. And Margaret, the burden they'd tried to erase, stood over them holding all the power. I'll be staying at a hotel tonight, Margaret said. My attorney will be in touch. She walked to the door, her head high, her back straight. Behind her she heard Jessica's sobs, David's desperate voice calling, Mom, please! Barbara's angry whispers to her daughter. Margaret didn't look back. She'd spent 3 years making herself smaller, 3 years apologizing for existing, 3 years being grateful for scraps. That woman was gone. The woman who walked out that door was Margaret Ann Peterson, and she'd just won. Margaret checked into a Hampton Inn that Sunday night. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. She sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. Her phone buzzed constantly. 17 missed calls from David, 12 from Jessica, 3 from Barbara Henderson. She turned it off and stared at the blank hotel wall. She'd won, but victory tasted like ashes. The legal proceedings moved with ruthless efficiency. Sarah Miller was a force of nature, and she'd been waiting for a case exactly like this. Within 48 hours, David and Jessica's attorney confirmed what Margaret already knew. They couldn't pay. They'd maxed out credit cards, their savings were depleted, and no bank would give them a loan large enough to satisfy the lien, not with the fraud investigation pending. They're asking if you'd consider a payment plan, Sarah told Margaret over the phone. 20 years at current interest rates. No, Margaret said. The word felt strange in her mouth. She'd spent a lifetime saying yes to David, accommodating, compromising, sacrificing. The house sells. It went on the market 2 weeks later. A 4-bedroom colonial in a good school district sold fast, even in a difficult market. The offers came in within days. David and Jessica had no choice but to accept one. Margaret watched from a distance as the "for sale" sign went up in the yard she'd planted. She drove by once, just once, and saw Jessica loading boxes into a moving truck, her face drawn and exhausted. Part of Margaret, the mother part that had loved these people, that had given everything, wanted to stop the car, wanted to say it was all a mistake, wanted to forgive and forget and go back to being small and grateful and invisible. But the stronger part, the part that had been forged in emergency rooms and night shifts and 40 years of survival, kept driving. The house sold for $485,000. After the real estate fees and the remaining mortgage balance was paid off, there was $267,000 left. Margaret's attorney ensured she received her full $247,000 first, directly from escrow, before David and Jessica saw a penny. That left them with approximately $20,000. Not enough for a down payment on anything comparable, not enough to maintain their lifestyle, not enough to erase what they'd done. Barbara Henderson called Margaret 3 weeks after the confrontation. Her voice was thick with emotion. "Margaret, I need you to know, Tom and I had no idea. If we'd known what Jessica was planning, what they'd done to you, we would have stopped it. We're horrified." "I know, Barbara," Margaret said gently. She'd never blamed them. She's in therapy now. She's trying to understand how she became this person, how we raised her to be better than this." Barbara's voice broke. "I'm so ashamed. She's your daughter. You love her. That doesn't make you responsible for her choices. Tom and I want you to know we're here for you, for anything you need. We mean that." Margaret thanked her and meant it. Jessica's parents were good people. Their daughter's greed wasn't their fault. David and Jessica moved into a small 3-bedroom rental in a less desirable part of town. Margaret heard through mutual friends that Jessica had to take on extra hours at work, that David looked hollow, aged 10 years overnight, that Emma cried about leaving her school and friends, that Lucas didn't understand why Grandma wasn't around anymore, the grandchildren. That was the part that hurt most. Margaret bought a condo 6 weeks after the house sold, a small 2-bedroom unit in a quiet community near the coast, 40 minutes from David's rental. It had a balcony overlooking the water, large windows that let in natural light, and most importantly, it was entirely hers. No one could take it. No one could erase her from it. She furnished it slowly, deliberately. A comfortable couch, a reading chair by the window, a bed that was hers alone, photos of Emma and Lucas on the mantel. She refused to punish the children for their parents' sins. They were innocent in all of this. Margaret joined a book club at the local library. She volunteered at a women's shelter, helping women who'd lost everything start over, women who reminded her of herself. She took morning walks along the beach, feeling the sand between her toes and the salt air in her lungs. She breathed freely for the first time in 3 years. She also started therapy. Dr. Patricia Rowan helped her process the betrayal, the grief, the complicated tangle of emotions that came with loving someone who tried to erase you. "You're allowed to mourn," Dr. Rowan told her. "You lost your son, even though he's still alive. That's a valid grief." And Margaret did mourn. Some nights she cried for the boy David had been, for the man she'd believed he could become. She cried for the family she'd thought she had. She cried for 3 years of making herself smaller, of believing she was the problem. But she also celebrated her freedom, her dignity, her refusal to go quietly. 4 months after the confrontation, David showed up at her condo. Margaret saw him through the peephole, thinner, older, beaten down. She almost didn't open the door, but she did. He stood on her doorstep with tears streaming down his face. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was weak. I let Jessica push, and I went along with it, and I have no excuse. What we did, it's unforgivable." Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. She saw genuine remorse, genuine pain. She also saw the man who'd filled out nursing home applications behind her back, who'd refinanced the house she'd saved without telling her, who'd sat silent while his wife called her a burden. "I forgive you, David," Margaret said quietly. His face lit up with desperate hope. "But forgiveness doesn't mean trust. Forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to how it was." "I know," he whispered. "I know, but maybe someday." "Maybe," Margaret said, "but that's years away, if it happens at all. You hurt me in ways I didn't think were possible. You betrayed every sacrifice I made. You tried to erase me. I know. You're my son. I love you. That doesn't just disappear, but you need to earn your way back, and that's going to take a very, very long time." David nodded, wiping his eyes. Can the kids see you? They miss you so much. Emma cries about you. Lucas asks when you're coming back." Margaret's heart cracked. "Not yet. I'm not ready yet." He left without argument. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her own tears falling. This was the cost of standing up for herself. This was the price of dignity. But as she walked to her balcony and watched the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret knew she'd made the right choice. She'd lost a son, at least for now. She'd lost daily access to her grandchildren. She'd lost the illusion of family she'd been clinging to. But she'd gained herself back. She'd gained her peace, her home, her self-respect, the knowledge that she was strong enough to fight for herself when no one else would. Margaret stood on her balcony, breathing in the salt air, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Free. 6 months after walking out of that living room, Margaret stands on her balcony watching another sunset. It's become her ritual, this daily moment of stillness where the sky transforms from blue to gold to pink to purple, where the ocean whispers against the shore, where she can simply exist without apology. The breeze carries the scent of salt and freedom. She wraps her cardigan tighter against the evening chill and thinks about everything that's changed, everything she's lost, everything she's gained. Her phone buzzes. A text from Emma now allowed supervised contact after Margaret finally agreed to see the children last month. "Grandma, I miss you. Can we have pancakes this Saturday?" Margaret's eyes fill with tears, the good kind this time. "Yes, sweetheart, Mickey Mouse shaped for Lucas." "Always," comes the response, followed by a heart emoji. The grandchildren weren't responsible for their parents' betrayal. Margaret won't punish them for sins that weren't theirs. But the relationship is different now. Scheduled visits, careful boundaries, and the understanding that some things, once broken, never quite fit back together the same way. David texts occasionally. Brief messages. "How are you, Mom?" "Thinking about you." "I'm still sorry." Margaret responds sometimes. Not always. She's learning that she doesn't owe anyone her immediate attention, her constant availability, her automatic forgiveness. She's learning that love doesn't mean erasing yourself. Jessica doesn't contact her. Margaret suspects pride prevents it, or maybe shame. Either way, the silence is fine. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ash. Margaret looks around her small condo, her sanctuary. The reading chair where she's discovered authors she never had time for. The kitchen where she cooks only when and what she wants. The second bedroom she's turned into a craft room, finally pursuing the watercolor painting she'd abandoned 40 years ago. The walls decorated with her choices, her colors, her life. This space is smaller than the guest room she occupied in David's house, but it's infinitely larger because it's hers. No one can take it. No one can post on Facebook that she's become a burden here. No one can fill out paperwork to remove her from her own life. She thinks about the woman she was 6 months ago, desperate to be wanted, willing to disappear, convinced her worth was measured by how little space she took up. That woman seems like a stranger now. Or maybe not a stranger. Maybe just a version of herself she had to shed to survive. Margaret has learned truths she wishes she'd known sooner. Truths she wishes she could whisper to every person who's ever made themselves smaller for someone else's comfort. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, not a transaction. It's supposed to be the place where you're loved, not for what you provide, but for who you are. When family becomes a balance sheet, what you've given versus what you're worth, it stops being family and becomes a business arrangement. And in business, when you're no longer profitable, you're expendable. Love isn't measured in sacrifice alone. Margaret had believed that giving everything, her money, her home, her identity, would guarantee love in return. She'd believed that if she just sacrificed enough, tried hard enough, made herself small enough, she'd earn the security of belonging. But love that requires you to erase yourself isn't love. It's exploitation wearing love's mask. Greed doesn't just destroy bank accounts, it destroys souls. David and Jessica didn't just steal money. They stole years of Margaret's peace, her trust, her belief in the goodness of family. They traded their integrity for financial convenience. They chose a house over a human being. And in doing so, they lost something far more valuable than property. They lost themselves. Never mistake gentleness for weakness. This might be the most important lesson. Margaret had spent 3 years being kind, accommodating, grateful. Her son and daughter-in-law mistook that grace for inability to fight back. They assumed the woman who'd given them everything had nothing left to give, including resistance. They forgot that the gentlest people are often gentle by choice, not by necessity. And when you back a gentle person into a corner, when you betray their trust and trample their dignity, you discover that gentleness was restraint, not weakness. Sometimes the kindest people have the strongest spines, because kindness isn't weakness. It's strength under control. And when that control is no longer warranted, when kindness is weaponized against you, the spine that's been there all along becomes visible. You're never too old to stand up for yourself. Margaret is 68. Society whispers that at her age, she should be quiet, compliant, grateful for whatever scraps of family she's given. But dignity has no expiration date. Self-respect doesn't retire. The right to fight for yourself doesn't diminish with age. If anything, it becomes more crucial. Every older person watching this needs to hear, you are not a burden for existing. You are not obligated to disappear quietly. Your life, your dignity, your worth. These things matter just as much at 68 as they did at 28. Margaret looks out at the darkening ocean and thinks about the version of herself that sold her house 3 years ago, the woman who believed that giving everything meant she'd never be alone. She wants to reach back through time and tell that woman, you are enough, your love is enough, and when it's not enough for them, that's their failure, not yours. Margaret turns from the balcony and walks inside, closing the door on the day. Tomorrow she's volunteering at the women's shelter again. Next week, her book club. Saturday, pancakes with her grandchildren in a neutral location, with boundaries she's established and enforces. Her life isn't what she planned, but it's hers. Completely, undeniably, irreversibly hers. And sometimes, losing everything is how you find yourself. Now, I want to ask you something. Put yourself in Margaret's shoes for a moment. What would you have done? If you discovered your own family, your own child, was planning to dispose of you after taking everything you had, would you have fought back? Or would you have gone quietly, believing that preserving the family relationship mattered more than your dignity? Would you have had the courage to walk out that door, knowing you might lose your grandchildren in the process? Would you have chosen justice over the illusion of peace? And here's the harder question. Have you ever made yourself smaller for someone else's comfort? Have you ever apologized for existing, for taking up space, for having needs? Have you ever confused sacrifice with love, giving with worth? Margaret's story isn't just about financial betrayal. It's about every person who's ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they're a burden. Every person who's ever been taken for granted. Every person who's ever had to choose between their dignity and their desire to be loved. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself in Margaret's pain or her strength, I need you to do something. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe someone who's making themselves too small, or someone who needs to understand the cost of taking people for granted. And subscribe. Subscribe because there are more stories like this. Stories about ordinary people who find extraordinary strength. Stories about justice, betrayal, and the moment when enough becomes enough. But most importantly, I want you to leave a comment. Tell me, what would you do in Margaret's situation? Have you ever had to choose between family and self-respect? Where are you watching from, and what's your story? Your voice matters. Your story matters. You matter at any age, in any situation, regardless of what anyone has told you about being a burden. Remember Margaret's lesson. Never let anyone convince you that standing up for yourself is selfish. Never let anyone erase you from your own life. Never apologize for refusing to be small. You are not a burden. You are a human being with dignity, rights, and worth that no one, not even family, gets to diminish. Stand tall, fight back when necessary, and never, ever forget. The people who truly love you will never ask you to disappear. Thank you for watching. Now go be your own hero.